Hey there. So this week we are reading from the Gospel of John, and we are in chapter 20, and we're reading verses 19 to 31. So make sure you take a chance and go ahead and read through that yourself. But just to summarize a little bit what's happening in this chapter, this is where Jesus, he has risen from the grave, and last week we talked about how he appeared to Mary, and this week he appears to the disciples. So Jesus appears to the disciples, and everyone is there except for Thomas. So after he appears to them, the disciples run and tell Thomas that they've seen Jesus, and Thomas's response isn't really what maybe you'd expect. Thomas, who has been a follower and a believer of Jesus for a couple of years now, says basically no, wait a minute, unless I've seen the holes where the nails were and touched his side, I don't believe that, basically. And it's interesting, Thomas gets this rap based on this piece of the Gospel of John, where he's referred to as Doubting Thomas a lot of times. A lot of times people refer to this reading as the reading about Doubting Thomas. And there's a couple of ways that I really relate to Thomas, and that's what I want to talk about along with this gospel reading. And I have to imagine for myself, if I put myself in Thomas's shoes, that if, all of my friends see Jesus, see this person that I love, who I've learned for, who I believe in, and I'm not there, I wonder to myself, is this just about non-belief for Thomas? And this is all speculation on my behalf, but, I just kind of can resonate with the fact that, I might be a little bitter and upset if I didn't get to see it myself, and how hard that might be for me to even believe. So I just was thinking about that and how I relate to Thomas here. But what then happens is about a week later, Jesus appears in this room that all of the disciples are in, including Thomas, and he acknowledges the disciples. He says, "Peace be with you." And then he immediately turns to Thomas and says, "Here are my hands, Thomas. Here's my side, touch it." And Thomas does not. He immediately says, "My Lord and my God," and acknowledges Jesus as such. And Jesus goes on to say, "Blessed are they who believe without seeing," basically. So I love this line of this gospel, and it's one of the things I really want to talk about today, because I believe that that message, those words, were spoken directly to you and directly to me, those who will come after the disciples, who will never see resurrected Jesus but believe. And it's almost like this blessing for us directly from Jesus, and I love this moment of this gospel. And there's a couple of things with Thomas and with this gospel reading that I think are really interesting. So I want to talk about those too. And one of them comes from earlier in the gospel. So it's in the chapter 11. We talked about Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead a couple of weeks ago in a different gospel. And in this gospel, Jesus is telling the disciples they're going to go into Judea, and they don't, of course, really know what they're going to do. And of course, this is, weeks before Jesus dies on the cross, but they are going, Jesus tells them they're going back to Judea, and the disciples are hesitant. Some of them say, "Wait, we can't go back there. They want to stone you, Jesus." And there's some conversation that takes place. But at the end of that, it's Thomas who says to them, let us go. And if we go, we will die with Jesus, basically. And so, there's this moment for Thomas in the Gospel of John where he's a strong believer in Jesus and Jesus' plan and what he wants to do. And he's also really brave. He's this brave believer in Jesus. And that resonates with me because as a believer, I think that we can sometimes be both, that brave, strong believer, and sometimes we can struggle with doubt. And for that reason, Thomas really speaks to me, and I really can relate to him and some of his experiences that happen in the Gospel of John. So I think that's interesting, and I think that is relevant to you and to me, because there will be moments in our life where, as Christians, as believers in Christ, we will stand strong in our belief and are willing to speak up. And there are moments where we'll have doubt for whatever reason, and that'll be a struggle for us. But I do believe that is okay, and and that doesn't make us any less of a Christian or anyone less than loves Jesus. And I think Thomas is a great example of that. So there's also a direct correlation, I think, in another chapter of John to this exact moment that we talked about in chapter 20. So there is this moment where Jesus is speaking to the disciples about heaven, but he's doing it in kind of a vague way. So he is basically preparing the disciples that he is going to be leaving, and he says he's going to go to this place and he's going to prepare them a room. And it's Thomas who speaks up and says, "But wait, Jesus, if we don't know where you're going, how can we go with you?" And Jesus says this, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and you have seen him." And as I read that direct interaction between Jesus and Thomas, and then I read what we read this week in the gospel about how when Thomas sees Jesus, he basically falls down and says, "My Lord and my God." I think there's a direct correlation in Thomas's mind, maybe like back to that teaching and back to that moment and back to that strong belief in Jesus. So I find that to be really interesting about Thomas's life and who Thomas is as a Christian and a disciple of Jesus. So this week, my prayer for you is that in your moments of doubt that you can turn to God and pray to him to help you trust in him and to help you with your struggles and doubts, and also just to take some time to reflect on, how maybe would you respond to the resurrection of Christ, to seeing Jesus, to being one of those disciples and Jesus is alive and before you. How would you respond to that? And also think about, I think, the life of Thomas, and both as a believer and both as in that moment of doubt that he had, and take some time to either meditate or even journal about how you maybe can relate to Jesus as a Christian today. So, I just think it's an awesome chapter of the Bible where Jesus appears to the disciples, and there's all of this interesting stuff happening, and it also ties back to who they were before and who they are in this moment. So take an opportunity to think about that in your own life. And know that we miss you. Your leaders and I are missing you every week. We are praying for you, and we can't wait to see you again. Peace.